Greeting of the day, everyone. I'm privileged to welcome you all into the third edition of Orange City Literature Festival, organized by SJR Knowledge Foundation in association with GH Raisoni University, powered by Raisoni Group of Institutions. I'm Smita Thote, delighted to be your anchor for today's session, The Politics of Desire in India by Ms. Madhvi Menon in conversation with Ms. Anuja Deshpande. Madhvi Menon is professor of English at Ashoka University. She earned her bachelor and master's in English from St. Stephen's College, Delhi University. She completed her PhD from Tufts University. Prior to joining Ashoka as one of its first faculty members, she taught at Ithaca College and American University. She is the author of several books of queer theory, Shakespeare, and the history of desire. Her most recent book is Infinite Variety, A History of Desire in India, and her forthcoming book is titled The Law of Desire. She is currently working on an edition of Shakespeare Richard II for the forthcoming series of Cambridge Shakespeare Edition. This version of the play thinks through the Sufi provenance of idea we commonly think of as Shakespearean. Professor Menon research interests include queer theory, Shakespeare, and histories of desire. She works with questions of sexuality, desire, gender, politics, history, and identity. It's an honor to have you with us, Ms. Madhvi Menon, and this gets even more delightful as we have Ms. Anuja Deshpande, who will be in conversation with her as the moderator. Ms. Anuja Deshpande, with her education in power engineering, MBA, MS in industrial engineering from University Houston, USA. Ms. Anuja Deshpande is personality of diverse interests and admiration. Being passionate about community service, she has been active in social sector for last 5 years. She has extensive experience in education projects, disaster management, presently working with funds development team at Seva International. I once again welcome you, Madhvi ma'am, and I welcome you, Anuja ma'am. Now, my dear audience, you are about to experience a conversation between two very dynamic individuals. So, without skipping a moment, I humbly invite Ms. Anuja Deshpande to lead us ahead.
Thank you, Smita. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Welcome, Madhavi ji. And I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with you today. Let me take this opportunity to express how honored I feel to talk to you about your book, about your research. It's a very interesting topic. It's a very interesting study of area that you work in. To start with, why don't we talk about something central idea of your book, that is history of desire, and how the British colonialism has shaped the current state of affairs.
Thanks, Anuja. Thanks, Smita. Thank you for your introductions, both of you. And thanks to OCLF. May it go from strength to strength. It's my privilege to be here, so thank you for inviting me. Anuja, your question actually makes me smile because, you know, one of the things I kept promising myself that I would not do when I was writing that book is I said I wouldn't blame the British for everything. But, but over and over again with each chapter, every time I was sort of thinking or immersed in a certain kind of plurality, a certain kind of multiplicity, a certain kind of syncretic approaches to desire in India, in the Indic subcontinent, it would all screech to a halt after the British arrived. And so despite myself, I found that colonialism really plays a very central role in making us who we are today. And how could it not, right? We were colonized for over 200 years. And in some ways, intellectually and conceptually, we are still colonized, I feel, especially in relation to desire. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't want to say that before the British came, everything was wonderful, and only after that it all went to hell. As you know, things are never that simple or that easy or clear cut. But I think what the British were able to do was that they were able to pick up on certain fault lines that existed in the subcontinent even before they arrived, and they were able to put pressure on those fault lines. So, for instance, the biggest fault line that existed and continues to exist today was that of caste. And the reason why the British loved the idea of caste is because it really played into their notion of purity and impurity. And they were so hell bent on imposing purity and sort of disposing of impurity, which included sexuality of all forms, unless it was sort of marital sex behind closed doors that resulted in children that no one actually saw, right? So unless it was that, it was impure and dirty and unclean. And so the language of the caste system gave them that space for thinking about purity and impurity. So suddenly they started saying, oh, this is good, that is bad, and started sort of slotting things into categories where that hadn't really happened to the same extent before. So they came with their ideas of prudery, of Victorian morality, of sex phobia, but they found here a language with which to discuss it in the subcontinent. And caste was one of those languages. Now, before they came, what we had was a landscape that was really, it was not without its bigotry, not without its prejudice, but there was much more of a sort of laissez-faire attitude, much more of a live and let live attitude. And so, you may not be doing exactly what I'm doing, but doesn't matter, right? The more the merrier. Let's all do different things and have fun together. That changed drastically. And then it became the sort of idea of one size fits all. We all have to speak the same language. We all have to look the same way. We all have to eat the same, all those things, which unfortunately, perhaps not surprisingly, we're seeing returning to our public discourse today. And so in many ways, that's why I said, I don't think, we were ruled by the British for 250 years, but they have left behind a certain conceptual terminology that people today continue to inhabit. And that, I think, is really worrying for all of us.
Absolutely, absolutely. Just as a follow-on question, so
Yeah.
before British came, India was also ruled by a lot of Mughal emperors. According to you, what was their ideology and what was their impact on what was happening before Mughal times in India in regard to desire and the landscape?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. As you know, before the Mughals, there were the Lodhis. Before the Lodhis, there were the Tughlaqs, and so on and so forth. So we've had sort of Muslims in the Indic subcontinent since at least 700, 800 AD. So we've had we've had this kind of syncretic culture for over thousands of years. The thing is, of course, even what we consider to be people who were here before that time came from the same parts of the world, right? Came from Persia, came from Central Asia. And so everyone here has collected. It's almost like people moved down from Europe and huge numbers of people from various parts settled here. In fact, that's one of the most fabulous things about the Indian subcontinent, right? Such diversity, so many kinds of people from so many parts of the world, so many traditions, customs, religions, foods. I mean, this is why Indian food is the best food in the world, because there's just so much influence from so many parts of the world. So the beauty of what happened before the British is with every set of people, including whether you call it start from the Harappans or whoever it is, every group of people who came to this part of the world mingled with all the people who were already here. So what happened in each successive generation of people who came here is that the fabric of what we call India became richer, thicker, more intricate, more delicately patterned. The big difference with the British was that they refused to mingle. They refused to sort of say, this is our land, we belong here. For them, there was always very clearly, we are superior, home is England, we are here just to loot you and to take all your money, and then we are going back. Nobody else, no group of people before the British ever said that or did that. And so that is the first significant difference. Specifically in relation to desire and specifically in relation to sexuality, what was fabulous about, especially under the Mughals, but also before that, was really the formalization of this kind of syncretic culture in India, which is to say they were among the biggest scholars of Sanskrit. They were the people who put together all our books on yoga. They were the people who illustrated and illuminated the Ramayana, the Mahabharata. They were the Sufis were the ones who were in conversation with Bhakti saints, and Bhakti saints vice versa with Sufi saints. So the period of the Mughal emperors, especially Akbar and Shah Jahan and Jahangir, was very much the sort of golden age of a certain kind of richness, culturally and sexually. Right? And so when they came in, for instance, the temples in Khajuraho were built at that time, 11th century, 12th century. We were already in the land of the Lodhis and the Tughlaqs. And there was never any kind of violence saying, I do things differently, why do you do things differently? I mean, this is what I was saying earlier, that there was a certain notion of why don't we add to what we have rather than shrink what we have, right? I mean, when you think about it, it stands to reason, right? Why would anyone want less? Won't we want more? And there's the sense that, and a lot of the Mughal emperors certainly owed their provenance to Persia, which was the high point of cultural sophistication at that point in the world. So all our jali work, all our kebabs, everything, mingled with what was going on here. And that's what we call India today. So sexually as well, there was as much diversity. So the kinds of illustrations, the kinds of paintings, the kinds of writings that you see under the Mughals was very, very sexually free, every bit as much as what was happening even before that. As I said, all that screeched to a halt after about 1600, before the empire was set up. The British were still only here trading, but already there was that kind of puritanism seeping into the ecosystem.
Right. Absolutely. Since we're already speaking about Islam and how the Mughals impacted the cultural fabric of India, in your first chapter of your book, there is a mention of Dargah desire, and we would really like to know more about it from you. What is the central idea of it? And
anybody anywhere in India, but I'm from Delhi, certainly in Delhi and the North Indian landscape, is dotted with dargahs. And dargahs, as we know, are holy places which are named after particular peers or particular saints. So, of course, one of the most famous dargahs in Delhi is the Nizamuddin Dargah, the Dargah of Nizamuddin Chishti, whose shagird or student was the famous Amir Khusro. And this is just one example. There are many, many, many thousands all over the city. And they're among the most beautiful and serene places because it's, there is no idol to be worshipped. There are no crowds of people except at certain points. And the certain points when there are crowds of people are when it's the mehfil that is set up, usually every Thursday evening, and the sama is organized. And so then there's a huge crowd. And actually, for those of us who love ghazals, unfortunately, that's not a time to go because it's just too many people. But otherwise, they're very peaceful places. And they contain in their stones such a rich history of culture and poetry and desire that I've always been fascinated by dargahs. Now, the main dargah that I write about in my book, Anuja, as you no doubt saw, is a dargah in the Mehrauli complex, which was actually built by the Qutubs. And the Mehrauli complex, and it's called the Jamali Kamali Dargah. And, was born in Delhi, grew up in Delhi, but for most of my life, I had never even visited Jamali Kamali. For all our school picnics and all, we would go to boring places like lakes or whatever. We wouldn't actually go to historical sites, you know. So finally, when I went to Jamali Kamali about maybe 15 years ago, I was just blown away by it, because there was, it was under lock and key, so you could only peer in from outside. But the courtyard around it, where the Sama would have been held, where the Mehfil would have jammed, was just beautiful. The mosque next door, which is no longer in use, just sort of see the stunning architecture, jali work everywhere, stars of Solomon everywhere. Just beautiful. But what also intrigued me is that I didn't know who Jamali and Kamali were, right? So they're not famous like Nizamuddin and Khusro, but yet it's a big dargah, it's a big mosque. So obviously he was a big person, a big Sufi saint in his time. And what's interesting is that Jamali was, you know, everyone knows who he is. He was a famous saint. A lot has been written about him. A lot has been written by him. But no one actually knows who Kamali is. And so if you ask people, which I did, I asked a lot of people, they'd say, oh, wo to he was Jamali's son, or he was Jamali's wife, or he was Jamali's student, or he was Jamali's lover. Like the answers range across the whole spectrum. You know, any relationality you can find, you'll get that. But what is interesting to me is that two things. One is this person, whoever the person is, was important enough to Jamali to be buried in the same dargah. So inside the dargah, it's only those two tombs. So like Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal you know, the sort of entire idea of the Taj Mahal built around two lovers, the dargahs always feature tombs of two people who are very close to each other. And so Kamali and Jamali were obviously extremely close to one another, whatever their relationship was. Chance, and also B, clearly this was accepted by everybody around them, because Jamali died first. And after Kamali died, it was all the people present at the time who would have had to build that tomb for Kamali. So obviously everyone around them completely accepted this relationship and were completely on board with it. So those two are important things to keep in mind, right? That they're following a certain romantic trope of, you know, janam janam ka saath. In this life and the next and every other life, we will be together because we're buried side by side. And two, that everyone around them seem to accept their desire. Once you take those two ideas into account, the question of Kamali's individual identity actually becomes less important, because it doesn't really matter who he was. Oh, and this is the third thing. We actually know it was a man, because the graves of men and the graves of women were architecturally different. So the graves of men were flat Sufi saints were flat to replicate a piece of paper on which the Sufi Pir would write his poetry. I'm getting this completely wrong. It had a flat surface with a pen case on top of it that would replicate the instruments that they used to write their poetry. The graves of Sufi saints who were female would just be flat because they would represent the paper that was written on. So the tomb of Kamali is the male grave. It has the pen case on it. And so we know that Jamali and Kamali were both men. We know that they were fulfilling this kind of romantic trope. We know that the relationship was accepted. Beyond that, who he individually was, I'm not that interested in. I mean, obviously I'm curious, but I'm not that interested. So what fascinates me is that there is a very real and deep tradition among Sufi saints of having intense relationships between two men. Now, clearly they did not call it homosexuality. And in fact, in India today, we don't really use the word homosexuality. There's sort of so many other terms that we use, right? Including dosti or yarana or whatever it is. And this kind of relationship between a teacher and a student is very, very famous for having these intense male-male bonds. And so the idea that these two men are buried side by side, for me, is a very clear indicator of what I have called dargah desire, because it's a desire that is intense and deep, but that you can't label or box with any certainty. You see, the trouble with labels like homosexuality or gay or even heterosexuality is that they presume that there's only one way to fit that label. Whereas if you have this certain kind of dargah desire, which is clearly desire, but is also so capacious that it is not naming itself as only one thing and not another. That to me is far more exciting. And so then it becomes interesting, uska shagird tha, uska dost tha, uska bhai tha, whatever it is. It is an intense male-male relationship that resists being named. And that for me is just fascinating.
Right. Absolutely. Like you mentioned that it is the perspective of the person who is talking about this Jamali and Kamali or whoever in the history they're talking about. It's their perspective, how they define the relationship. So do you think that in the history of this writing, the desire itself has been named depending on who the author is, depending on what his view of the entire idea is?
I mean, that's a great question, Anuja. The thing is that we, as I said, we have multiple names in India for everything, right? I mean, this is the beauty of India, is that it's a land of multiplicity. Which is why, you know, what's going on now, I find a little scary, because there's a move towards singularity. So there's a move towards, for instance, saying, for example, Jamali and Kamali were homosexual. And I'm a little nervous about that kind of singularity and certainty, because I far prefer the realm of the multiple. I far prefer the realm of uncertainty in that sense, right? So for instance, so I can be something today, but maybe 5 years later, I want to be something else. And I should have the freedom to make that choice and that movement rather than just being boxed in one way or the other. So it's not, for instance, that women have not had sex with women or men have not had sex with men for the entire history of humankind on Earth. So the Indic subcontinent is no different from that history. Even a text like the Manusmriti, which is an awful, bigoted, hate-filled text in many, many ways. It's the fundamental source of what we now understand as the caste system in India. Even that text has sections about women who have sex with women and men who have sex with men. And of course, you know, prescribes punishments for them, but doesn't necessarily call them by a particular name. For him, what's much more important is caste. So he'll say if an upper caste man has sex with a lower caste man, then this is the punishment. Or if an upper caste woman has sex with a lower caste woman, then this is the punishment. So it's horrible that he's prescribing punishments, but it's interesting that it's not unknown to him as a behavior. It's not unknown to him as a mode of being in the world. So we have always had this. If you look at the sculptures on Khajuraho, you will see men, women, men, women, animals, multiple men. I mean, you will see the whole range. No text around that time will say, this is what this is called. A text like the Kama Sutra, which Vatsyayana prides himself on naming things, right? There are 6 types of women, there are 6 types of men, 6 types of genital organs, so on and so forth. And then he will say, passion knows no order. Therefore, even though I've given you all these tables, actually things are much bigger than that. So we have always had this understanding. You take any of the Sufi poets, you take Khusro, you take Bulle Shah, you take Mir, anybody, they will always say things like Bulle Shah, for instance, has this magnificent poetry where he describes himself wearing a burqa in service to Shah Inayat, but he will still call himself he. So there is this idea of transgender, homoerotic, homosexual, transsexual. I mean, we've had all these in our histories. And I think the reason we have had so many versions of these multiple sexualities over thousands of years is precisely because we haven't named them. It's precisely because we have retained a certain kind of fluidity. And so what I find very frustrating is that, you know, certain voices in the so-called West will sort of say, oh, we are so progressive because we have gay pride, or we have this and we have that. And it's like, that's actually not that progressive. What would be really progressive is an entire cultural milieu in which there are so many multiple strands and no desire to actually pin each one of them down. That for me would really be a thing to look forward to.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I actually agree in parts with you about the gender fluidity and how it was quite accepted and recognized before what we know, the recent history of India.
Yeah.
For that. Absolutely wonderful. My next question is, I am personally interested in Kathak. I have learned a little bit, and it's a dance of expression. You express your emotions through that dance.
Right.
And I wanted to know from you if you have studied this cultural integration of desire and art, specifically dance forms. So is
Right.
there any history of that as well?
Right. I mean, Anuja, I'm sure you have a lot more to teach me about that, since I'm certainly not a scholar of dance or a dancer. But yes, I have done some work on that. And actually, this ties together with what you just said before you asked me that question. When you were talking about gender fluidity, what's interesting is that, again, across the Indic subcontinent, in terms of dress, in terms of hair, in terms of appearance, the difference between men and women was actually not great at all. Both men and women had long hair. Both men and women wore similar clothes, right? Salwar and pants, or just sort of, dress and top, both men and women. Both men and women used to wear makeup extensively. The Kama Sutra has a whole section on men's makeup and saying how if your woman friend's makeup runs in the rain, you have to fix it for her, addressing the man, right? So men wore makeup rampantly. There's a section on where you get your lipstick from for men, where you get your eyeliner from, all that. In terms of jewelry, as you know, again, men and women often similarly dressed. You only need to look at images of, let's say, the huge pantheon of over 33 million Hindu gods to see the male gods and the female gods dress very alike. Each of them has jewelry, each of them has long hair, each of them wears similar clothes. So gender fluidity manifested itself at that level of everyday life, the way we dress. Today, just look at you and Smita and me. Everyone will say we are women because we dress in a particular way. And if there were three men, they would say they're men because they would dress in a particular way. This was not true at all till about 250 years ago, 300 years ago. So we need to remember that. And dance actually is one of those arenas in which you can still see signs of that. In which you can still see, because male dancers will wear jewelry, will wear makeup, will wear clothes every bit as gorgeous as the female dancer. And perhaps even more important, Anuja, certainly in Bharatanatyam, which I know a little more about, but you should tell me about Kathak as well. For instance, if a woman is dancing and she is dancing to a bhakti poem in which the addressee is Krishna, she is not suddenly going to change her clothes when she is dancing Krishna's part. And so women dancers will dance both male and female roles. Male dancers will dance both male and female roles. Can you imagine a scene, let's say in a ballet, in which a male dancer will dance both male and female? Absolutely not. So the performance traditions in India, all of them, are at that level also very gender fluid, are very, very sort of sexually promiscuous, for lack of a better word, because that kind of separation simply doesn't exist. Performance is a way of bringing together things that are scattered in the world. Again, it doesn't make sense to me that in something that's meant to bring things together, why would you want to institute separations? But I think performance is one of those arenas.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Something that you relate to and get to know a bit more about it. It's really eye-opening and liberating, I would say.
Yeah.
There is one particular question I had when I was going through the synopsis of your book, that love, sex, and desire, they go hand in hand. But however, does the notion of love subscribe to the theory of relationship without desire? Or vice versa, does the physicality aspect of a relationship will it exist without what we call desire?
Right. Anuja, sorry to do this again. I'm so annoying, I know. Apologies. But what you said before this question actually reminded me of something else as well. So let me just address that quickly before I address your question. And this has to do with dance performances itself, right? So for instance, and as I told you, I know a little bit more about Bharatanatyam. That's why I'm talking about that. But the entire sort of Devadasi tradition especially in South India. The entire Devadasi tradition, which was deeply immersed, the North Indian version was the Tawayaf tradition, right? The courtesan tradition. The entire culture was steeped in dance, in music, in culture, in etiquette, in tehzeeb, right? So the courtesans of Lucknow, the courtesans of North India were the keepers of culture, were the keepers of the flame. Similarly, the Devadasis were the keepers of a certain kind of temple culture, were the keepers of a certain kind of cultural memory in the South. And again, in the North and in the South, the Vayavs and Devadasis were accepted and revered, in fact, worshipped. You have records from among the Mauryas, for instance, they were government servants, they were paid official salaries. Veena Oldenburg has done fabulous research on the courtesans of Lucknow, who were among the biggest taxpayers. So they were among the richest people in the town. As soon as the British come and they see this and they are horrified by it, they immediately take Devadasis and Tawayafs and their exalted social status and turn them into what they call prostitutes.
Right.
And so what they do is completely separate again sex or eroticism from culture, from performance, from history, from religion, from a certain kind of tehzeeb. Historically, that has not been the case in India. In India, historically, all these things are come together, exist together. Which brings me to your question now, that separation between love and desire, or understanding things like love and desire as being separate things, is also a very, very new phenomenon. We didn't have things like that, right? So there was no sense of, oh, I am going to have sex with someone, therefore I must love them. Or if I love them, then that is more important than the sex. I mean, I think Vatsyayana would have been puzzled saying, what are these words you're using? I have no idea what that means. So there is a sense in which karma, two things about karma. One is that it is an essential part of life. That in fact, you cannot think of living without karma being an essence of it, an important part of it, a pillar. Second, and this is more important and addresses, I think, your question as well, karma is not just about acts of genital sex. Karma, according to the Kama Sutra, is about 64 different arts,
Right.
including dancing, including singing, including leaf cutting, including wine making, including cooking of various foods, including a knowledge of herbs, including writing poetry, including reciting poetry. Karma means all these things. What we have done under a certain kind of colonial influence is leached our idea of karma so much that it has shrunk to this idea of genital sex. Which is why then we say, oh, what is the relationship between love and sex? Or what is the relationship between love and desire? And that is not a question historically that in the entire Indic subcontinent makes sense. If we then move to our current day and sort of say, okay, but nowadays that's how we speak. So what is the relationship between love and desire, or desire and love? I prefer the word desire, as you know, if you know, when you look at my book, I prefer the word desire because to me it approximates most fully the inability to fix things or the inability to settle things. Because, you also, Anuja, I'm sure, and Smita, you too, when you hear the word desire, you say, but what does that mean? Is it desire for food? Is it desire for love? Is it desire for new clothes? Is it desire for a new book? And it is precisely that capaciousness that I want to retain by using the word desire. Unfortunately, when we use the word love today, especially in romantic, in the romantic arena, we tend to think of a particular kind of sentimentalized Archie's greeting card version of love. And so I wanted to distance myself a little bit from that because that's not what I'm talking about, right?
Right.
What I'm talking about is a certain kind of capaciousness that I think is captured better by the use of the word desire. And so when we say love is separate from desire, my response to that would be it has been separated from it, but it doesn't actually have to be separate from it at all.
Absolutely true. That's a wonderful definition of desire, encapsulating love as well as the physicality of it. And
Yeah.
I really wish that today's generation do understand this concept moving forward in their life,
Yeah.
because we can see a lot of so I've stayed in US for a while, and this generation, this entire generation of millennial kids that we call,
Yeah.
everything starts with the physicality of it, and then we will see how it happens. And so, and I come from a little old school of thought that you have to have a connection, at least, if we don't call it love, but you at least have to have a connection to get there. So this definition of desire that you have presented, it really it's a good mix of both the ideas.
Yeah, yeah, I hope so. Although Anuja, what you just said, I mean, when you said you're old school and therefore you think there has to be a connection, that is a very sort of Western notion of, not even Western, I won't even call it Western. It's a very sort of uh, biblical, Christian colonial notion. I won't even say it's Christian. It's sort of a colonial notion of saying, because it comes from a position of saying sex is bad. And therefore, we try and say, oh, but if there's a connection, it's okay. And I know what you mean. I hear what you're saying. But I'm trying to actually say that we shouldn't be saying that. Because if we go back, let's say, to Sufi poetry or even to the Kama Sutra, sex is, for Vatsyayana, it's like reciting poetry, which is to say, yes, you have to have a desire for it or to do it, but it doesn't necessarily mean it ties you down or binds you in stone. So when we say today, and I am also a post-colonial subject, so I also am inherited all this notion of this idea of, sex has to be meaningful, it has to have a certain kind of language of emotion. But I think actually that language comes, or that insistence comes from a sex phobic position. We never ever see that in any of the literature that we read before, let's say, 1800 or 1850. After that, we see it everywhere. And so for me, I know what you're saying, but I also think we should try and resist that, because actually it might end up doing more damage. So for instance, it leads to the entire idea, for instance, of when we think of rape or rape victims, and that horrible tradition in India where rape victims, the rapists are told to marry the rape victims precisely because, oh, now you've had sex, so you have to be married. And that comes from the same school of thought. Ki sex is the most shameful thing, therefore it has to be tied up with something good or something nice. And so I'd like to think that we need to resist that a little bit, because otherwise it can turn into these kinds of really awful ways of approaching the world as well.
True. That is eye-opening. I have not thought about it in this perspective, but thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much. You also, in your book, there is a little bit humor also, and you have used, I mean, it was very fascinating to know about how you refer mathematics and connect it with desire, the equation. Can you tell us more about the relationship between desire, fractions, and I think Bollywood that you're talking about?
Yeah. I'm so glad you liked that chapter. I mean, I love it. It's one of my favorites because I'm also talking in it primarily about one of my favorite films of all time. And whoever members of the audience watching this, if you have not seen a movie called Ded Ishqiya, then please stop watching the session right now and go and watch the movie first, because it's just a brilliant film, and I really highly recommend it to everybody. What's fascinating about that film, and what I think about in relation to desire, in relation to mathematics, is that title Ded Ishqiya, right? I mean, what does that mean? Why is it Ded? Why is it 1.5? Why is it not? We are used to Ishqiya 1 or Ishqiya 2 or Dhoom 500. There are all these sort of sequels. But we're not used to sort of Ded Ishqiya.
Right.
But then you remember the sort of Kabir Doha about Dhai Akshar Prem Ke. So there is a certain tradition of having fractions in relation to desire in India. So that got me curious about, what is this about? Why was this film called Ded Ishqiya? Why do we think in terms of fractions? And I don't want to, give away the plot of Ded Ishqiya, because I really do think you should all watch it. But all I will say is that the locus of desire in that film, the romantic center of that film, we don't actually know about till the very end of the film, or till about 3/4 of the way through the film. And so there is some, and it's not a normative desire, it's not a heteronormative desire. So it seems to me that the makers of the film, who I think are really quite brilliant, Abhishek Chaubey is the director, that there is a way in which they put together the idea that non-heteronormativity is best expressed by a certain kind of fraction rather than a whole number. And that goes back, right, Anuja, to the conversations we've been having about not having labels that are fixed and fixable, about having capacious borders and boundaries that you can move across. So date becomes between 1 and 2, but also neither 1 nor 2.
Right.
So it's sort of, it is pointing to an in-betweenness, which we too easily forget in terms of desire because we're so busy saying we are either this or we are that. And so Ded Ishqiya, the movie, I think speaks as much to mathematics as to desire because it suggests that there is a certain mathematical way of resisting the fixity of desire. And so, you know, the way in which we think about, you know, even now we use phrases like so and so is my other half, or so and so is my better half. Because mathematically, when we think about desire, usually we think about each person in a couple, and couple also is a mathematical term because it's two. Each person in a couple is half and half. And so two people come together to make one unit. And which is why we have this horrible practice of women changing their names so that the men's names, so you're one unit. Please, all the women watching this, please never, ever, ever change your names. Anyway, when you think in terms of fractions, there is no desire to be either 1 or 2. So then what happens to desire, right? You're not pretending ki you are my other half, you're my other half. We make each other whole, completely forgetting all the fights that you have, all the kitpit, all the sort of, you know, ways in which you don't get along, all the ways in which you are your own person. And the other person is their own person, and that's the way it should be. So what Ded Ishqiya does, or what the idea of fractions do, is it suggests that there is some kind of in-between space in which you don't have to wholly merge and you don't have to be wholly separate, but that you are in a space that allows you room to maneuver, room to move in. And that is why, as you will see, this film is called Ded Ishqiya, because it explores those spaces and those rooms in which we can move.
Right. Very interesting, very intriguing. In fact, it was a very the feeling of reading when I was reading through that particular chapter. I come from an engineering background, so I have a little bit of soft corner for mathematics.
Yes.
And it being interwoven with a concept of desire, it was very interesting for me to read through. And thank you for elaborating on that.
And Anuja, just before we move on, you know, mathematics, when you ask any mathematician, for instance, why do you like maths or why do you love maths? Almost always they will say it's the most beautiful subject, right? That there's a beauty in maths that you won't find anywhere else. And I like that idea of beauty. But what I also like about the beauty of mathematics is that there is nothing what we would call sort of real about it or concrete about it, which is to say, there is nothing in the world that is one. There's nothing in the world that's two. We say, let this be one. And then this is two. So it's entirely abstract and entirely beautiful because in abstraction, you can make beautiful patterns in that. All that to me seems to be part and parcel of this thing we call desire. You know, the beauty of it, the patterns of it. And I think that's why I have a deep respect actually for maths, precisely because of that beauty in it.
You know, there is a famous saying, maths is not science, it's an art.
Is that right? That's great.
Yeah. I recently read somewhere, I don't know I don't remember the reference, but that's what I read, and it just hit me in the right place, you know.
I love it. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. We also spoke about transgenders. While I was working on field during COVID relief efforts, we worked with a lot of LGBTQ communities, specifically transgender community. and they are increasingly marginalized these days. Uh, but gender as such was fluid. It was understood as a fluid, like you mentioned before. How do we, moving forward, how do we make it more fluid and how do we become more inclusive? Uh, you know, given the politics of desire that we
Yeah.
see.
Yeah. I mean, Anuja, that is such an important question that you've asked. I mean, it's a really, as you saw in your field work, it is a matter of life and death. It's that important. And what is again tragic about what's happening now and what's fascinating about what used to be the case is that in recent years, certainly in the big metros, you will see members of the Hijra community, for instance, more and more being reduced to becoming beggars at intersections and at lights. And certainly when I was growing up in Delhi, that was not the case at all. So this is really a phenomenon over the last 15, 20 years, I'd say, and not before that. And even that phenomenon is the result of many, many hundreds of years during which the British systematically and ruthlessly suppressed transgender communities across India. And again, that's something that current politicians and governments are also doing tragically. When the British came, and in the 18th century, in the 19th century, they passed an act called the Criminal Tribes Act, specifically to criminalize hijras, kinnars, jogtis, jogtas, all the, again, we're India, right? We have multiple names for everybody. And they criminalized them because the sexual politics of non-conforming people horrified the British. And they were everywhere. Nobody sort of said, oh, you are different, or you have to be marginalized, or you must not enter my house, or you have to beg for your alms, right? What the British did by criminalizing, no less, criminalizing Hijra communities or transgender communities is that they slowly took away from them all their means of livelihood. They said it is a crime to sing and dance in public. It is a crime to dress in clothes other than what you're supposed to wear. And they criminalized all these activities that for thousands of years in the subcontinent have been sacred. Not only do you have that entire concept of Ardhanarishwara, the entire idea of in one being you are two, you have the entire idea of the very word hijra coming from the word hijira, which marks the flight of Prophet Muhammad from Mecca to Medina. And so the very word hijra marks a flight to safety. It marks a flight away from persecution towards safety. And so in all the cultures of India, the idea of hijras has been sacred. And now we have come to such a pass, started over the last 250 years, beginning with the criminalizing of hijras. We have come to this pass in which, Anuja, as you quite rightly say, we have all been hit badly by the pandemic, but perhaps the transgender community and sex workers community has been hit much, much harder than anybody else. What do we do about this, right? In many ways, Anuja, this has actually been your core question throughout that you have been asking me, right? Which is, what do we do about the situation that we're in now? And there has to be a sense of education. And I say this not only because I'm a professor and I'm deeply invested in education, but education not in terms of IIT JEE or CAT or cracking the CAT or all these tuitions, none of that. We really need to know not just sort of Indian traditions, because I think the idea of India is actually being misused and abused right now. So I do not want any part of that. But the idea that we are multiple, anybody, any single human being is multiple. And by education, I mean the ability to see multiplicity, to recognize complexity, and to appreciate and respect that complexity, whether it's in the environment, whether it is among human beings, whether it is in relation to our resources, whether it is in relation to our sexual orientations. In all realms, for me, education means recognizing the complexity and the interrelatedness of all these realms. once we are educated, right? And what we are doing, what's happening increasingly these days is that more and more Indians are going to what we call WhatsApp University,
Yes.
where all they are fed is stories of hatred, stories of violence, stories of bigotry, stories of singularity. We need multiplicity. We need multiple stories. We need multiple stories that can be told through dance, through song, through performance, through environmental activism, through all these things that are going to make our lives richer. Without that education, Anuja, I really despair that anything is going to happen. Because, and this is why I say I don't necessarily mean technical education or anything, even our lawyers, even our educated judges, I mean, what are they doing? Our journalists, what are they doing? They are doing nothing to sort of expand the idea of what it means to be educated, or what it means to be a citizen of the world. They're doing nothing to do that. In fact, they are doing everything to cater to narrowness and bigotry. So, unless we appreciate multiplicity, unless we appreciate that every human being is important and has something to contribute, unless we appreciate that the environment is not something alag se, different from us, it's us. Without the environment, we can't live. So, killing it and cutting down trees and mining for coal, that's not what we should be doing. Unless we have that kind of holistic image of how to live, the tragedy is just going to get worse and worse of how we are living right now. And I must say, I am very disheartened from day to day. I am very despondent listening to the kinds of news that happens, thinking about the kinds of ideas that are circulating. I am certainly very despondent. But let's hope and assume that there will be a change at some point.
Absolutely. Let's hope so. And we as citizens have a lot to contribute and a lot to evolve,
Yes.
I would say, before even we can contribute in our own
Exactly.
mindset and in our own thought process, that we have to evolve ultimately. And just a small question, I think I missed out on that. Talking about every human is equal. For the past few years in the recent history of India, women were suppressed. They were not allowed to even express their thoughts. How they have, I mean, what was the way and how did they navigate through this expression of desire landscape, and how it changed? How is it changing now?
Yeah.
Still, I see women are not very vocal about expressing their desires.
Exactly. Yeah. And Anuja, again, I think that's a very important question. Even if we just go back to the courtesan culture, to Tawayafs, to Devadasis, and I said they were among the highest taxpayers for centuries. There was a very real presence of women in the public sphere and in the public sphere of desire. They were revered, exalted. Vatsyayana, for instance, has an entire book in the Kama Sutra on the courtesans, in which he treats them with great respect and deep respect. The trouble is, and I think this is always the problem with what people call prostitutes today, what we might call sex workers. The problem is that women working with sex or in the field of sex are taboo on two fronts in our colonized world. One is that it's women dealing with sex, but perhaps even more important, it's women who are financially independent. And we live in such a patriarchal world where women are not supposed to work, not supposed to go out in public, that sex workers who are women are shunned and criminalized and hounded on all fronts. And so women's relationship to desire has been curtailed ever since the British came in. And certainly nowadays, with this sort of Hindutva notion of women should be this way, women should be that way, it's just absurd. And if you think about alternative traditions, so for instance, if you look at jurisprudence, and as Smitha announced, my next book is on the law of desire, so I'm very interested in law. If you look, for instance, at Islamic jurisprudence, it is much, much, much more open and flexible in relation to women than, let's say, Hindu family law, right? So in under Islam, first of all, first and foremost, marriage is not a sacred act; it is a contract. Both male and female, both husband and wife, are equal partners in that contract. In fact, the husband has to pay meher to his wife. The wife can annul the contract every bit as much as the husband can. Wife, all the property in the wife's name remains in the wife's name. Wife, in fact, does not even change her name. You compare that to Hindu family law, where the head of the undivided Hindu family can only be a man. Where the question of inheritance for daughters continues to be a vexed question. And in fact, only recently in the last year, the Supreme Court says, no, you should allow daughters also to inherit. But until that point, it was, and even now, most people will not do it. So the question of which is to say, there are present in India ideas allowing women more freedom, and there are also present in India ideas allowing women less freedom. What we are doing right now is inhabiting those ideas that allow women less freedom. And we need to find our way back to a moment in time, a moment historically, a moment experientially, in which giving freedom to women is a part of life, not any favor that anyone is going to do for you and me. We should, without question, have equal access to everything. But sometimes, and here I am living in Delhi, the capital of this country, there are many days in which I can walk on the roads and be forgiven for thinking that Delhi belongs only to men, because you will hardly see any women outside. You go to South India, for instance, it's completely different. Many, many more women outside. I went to Iran a few years ago. So many women outside, women taxi drivers, women bus drivers, women business people, women. Have you ever seen a woman driving a bus in Delhi? Never. So we are very narrow-minded when it comes to putting women out in the public sphere. And that is a huge problem. And we need to deal with that, because the fear of women in relation to desire is the same fear of women being seen in public. And we need to figure that out. We women need to fight for it, because no one's going to give it to us. And unless we organize and fight for it and say, we're not asking you for permission, we're just taking what is our right? Sada hak ethe rak. That is the kind of language we need to speak.
Absolutely, Madhviji. I think we might be running out of time soon. Just I think last thought on my part, like you said, differentiated between two religions, or two communities, if I must say. But I think in India we have such multiple communities. The idea of freedom for women, it is not subjected, or it is not construed just to one community. I think that idea of giving freedom to women, or taking it basically, will come from multiple communities together.
Yes.
The change has to be in multiple communities together.
I completely agree, Anuja, but also regionally, right? This is why I said if you go to South India, there are many more women outside. I really do think that North India has a problem. I'm sorry to say it, and I'm sorry to sound bigoted, but because I'm from here and I grew up here, the number of women in public has gone down over the years rather than gone up. And I think that's a problem. I think it is a deep problem. And as we know, rape culture, again, in North India is huge and rampant. And so you're absolutely right. Regional differences, geographical differences, educational differences, communal, all these make a difference in how we think about desire. That's absolutely right.
Absolutely. On that note, I think I would like to thank you for joining us today. And it was a wonderful conversation. I hope I didn't cross my line, or, asked you something that was out of limit.
Not at all. It was a pleasure to be in conversation with you, Anuja. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madhviji. Thank you, Smita.
Thank you, Smita.
You're on mute, I think, Smita.
We can't hear you, Smita.
At the outset, I would like to thank Ms. Madhvi ma'am, Ms. Anuja Deshpande ma'am, for joining us today. We wish to get you hear you both again and be equally enlightened as we all are today. And for my dear massive audience, I'm sure that after witnessing this conversation, you are all taking home an enriched version of yourself, just as I will. Thank you for joining us today. Until I see you again, this is Smita Dhote signing off. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Welcome to Rai Soni Group, a vision beyond.